You get me, get you. You get me, feel it, you. You get me, get you. You get me, feel it, you. You get me, get you. You get me.
Hello, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I'm your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group. That's a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Thank you to Pew Research Center for making today's conversation possible, as well as to our good friends at Village Square. And now we have a lot to get to today. This midweek episode is usually a little bit more brief, but we have a lot to talk about, so let's get right to it. I'm so happy to be joined today by our friend Lori Adams Brown. A lot of folks who've been listening for a while know Lori by now, but just to reset briefly, Lori Adams Brown has been on this program numerous times. She's known for helping global leaders build innovative and inclusive workspaces. She's also the host of a terrific podcast called A World of Difference and the author of a really poignant, well-informed Substack, which we'll talk a little bit about today. She leads and influences culture from a multilingual voice. But the reason I wanted to bring Lori back today in particular is that she's a U.S. citizen who was raised in Venezuela. So most importantly, Lori, how are you? How are your loved ones? How are your friends holding up?
Well, first of all, it's an honor to be back. I always love our conversations and appreciate the space where we can talk about hard things with a lot of nuance because really that's behind the question that you're asking. And thank you for asking about friends and loved ones. I, as you mentioned, grew up in Venezuela, so I have so many people that I love that are affected by this. I couldn't even count the amount of people, but I've checked in with all my people. They're all doing okay, but we're all in this position of sort of waiting for the next shoe to drop, which if you've ever gone through anything like this, and I hope nobody ever has, it
Yeah.
can be a lot of hypervigilance. So yeah, everybody's the ones that are still in Venezuela, and I guess we'll get into some of that conversation, but I have friends, family, loved ones, people I went to school with, teachers, Sunday school teachers, friends that I was sat in Sunday school with under the mango tree, and all kinds of people that I knew and love. And some of them have stayed and some are in that diaspora of 8 million who've gone to all kinds of other countries, from Colombia to Spain to here in the US. And so I've checked in with everybody. Thank God for WhatsApp. But I also don't know how honest people can really be, the ones that are still there because of such a repressive regime. And we'll get into some of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So before we do, I do want to address something that folks who are listening, we're recording this on a Wednesday. So you've had 3 or 4 days to process the initial strike in Venezuela, the Trump administration's actions. But just this afternoon, we're reading about another story. I don't want folks to think that we're ignoring that. What I'll do is I'll just read the Reuters summary of what happened. And we may talk about this here with Lori. But like I said, I do want to focus on Venezuela in this conversation. So let me just read this story from Reuters. A U.S. immigration agent shot and killed a 37-year-old woman in her car in Minneapolis on Wednesday amid an immigration enforcement surge. According to local and federal officials, the latest violent incident during President Donald Trump's nationwide crackdown on migrants. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey adamantly rejected the Trump administration's assertion that the agent fired in self-defense, saying video of the shooting directly contradicted what he called the government's garbage narrative. This is something that's touching a lot of us. There are threads that sort of weave together here. I know that our church went viral. Our little tiny church went viral when our pastor was basically just saying, hey, here's what we as a church are obligated to do. If ICE officers come to our church, they're welcome to worship with us. He basically said, here's our legal obligations. And we have our friend who isn't, doesn't have updated paperwork. So they are not allowed to go here. So he was just up to, and it like, his posts get all of about 12 likes or views, and that one got hundreds of thousands of views and all kinds of terrible comments. But like I said, a lot of these stories are intertwining because of the administration that we're under right now. Do you, before I don't want to be presumptuous, so did you want to process some thoughts on that, on what happened in Minnesota today?
Well, I, it's horrible. I mean, violence is unfortunately something we are becoming way too desensitized to, which is part of the conversation around Venezuela itself and why people for 27 years have kind of turned a blind eye what's going on there. And all of a sudden it's trendy, but how long will it stay in the news? And I feel like that's sort of what's happening here. This is a life. This is a person. This is a human being. For those of us who understand the sacredness of humanity, this should grieve us. And yet, this amount of violence is also not something we were created to be able to process, especially so far away in news that feels isolated. And so, anytime there's a situation like this, there's always so much behind it, a lot of fear, and that whole situation can also cause fear for so many people. And I mean, here we talk about politics, right, and religion. I mean, all of these are elements. This Venn diagram of what's going on here, and so absolutely, ICE has been overreaching in ways that are terrifying and very reminiscent of some things we've seen in other parts of the world throughout history, including on these lands a while back. And so it is not new in some ways, and yet it should be over. Somehow humanity has not learned its lesson that we have more in common than we don't. And
Mm.
so that's what my life abroad has taught me. And when you see another person as a threat because of either their color of skin or their religion or their politics, to the point of violence, and especially if you act in such a way with your power to abuse that violence and that power that you have toward a person who has much less power or privilege or opportunity to even defend themselves, it's absolutely egregious and it's enraging. So
Yeah.
I think those of us who are justice minded, we hear things like that and we often don't know the whole story, but that is a terrifying thing because we see that the media has been for a long time, but especially under the Trump administration and of course certainly under the Maduro regime, repressed the truth in the media, and that is kind of step one of this sort of tyrant playbook.
Yeah, yeah. I've noticed that the entire administration, it seems like, kicked into gear in terms of painting a narrative that's largely fictional because the video is readily available. Like multiple angles of the video are readily available. So it's pretty clear what actually happened. I'm hesitant to talk too much about it because it happened today. I haven't
Yeah.
seen all the angles. I haven't read up about it. So I'm hesitant to talk about it. But listen, this is horrifying. It's tragic, but it's not surprising. I mean, and that
No.
even saying that is part of the tragedy is that it's not surprising.
Yeah.
So
Right.
maybe we'll process that story, that developing story, and that tragedy a little bit further, and talk about it next time. I should just have you back next week.
That's right. Let's come
Yeah,
back.
yeah, yeah. But let's set the table this way. I'd love for you to give us, if you would, a little background on what it was like for you. I live in Valencia, California, but you grew up in the 80s and 90s in Valencia, Venezuela. Can you give us a
I
little bit of background in
did.
that? Yeah.
I love the name Valencia. It's just got such warmness in my heart. There's even a street here in the Mission District in San Francisco called Valencia. And when I go there, it is nothing like home, but it just feels like it should be because I just
Yeah.
love the name. But it has such happy memories for me. And I think that if you are younger or maybe aren't well versed in either geography or history of Venezuela, and I think most people aren't super familiar with the history, and it is complicated and hard to explain. But I grew up in the 80s and 90s, some really good years. And I loved the place I grew up. I have friends that are just family to me. And I learned so much growing up there about community and a collective mindset where we belong to each other and we care for one another and we share and we survive together. I think I had a taste of that, but my gosh, certainly Venezuelans have strengthened that muscle over the last 27 years under the early parts of the Chavez regime all the way through Maduro and what is turning into a version of that now. And I sort of would describe it as, I guess, a Hydra head has been chopped off, but then we've got all these other heads that are still there. And so, yeah, it was a great place to grow up. I grew up in the industrial center of the country. So Valencia is about 2 hours west of Caracas, the capital, which many people would have seen on the night of January 2nd here in California, early morning, January 3rd, when U.S. military operation went in and sent all kinds of. Well, the first video I saw was my brother putting it in our group chat, and my older brother is married to a Venezuelan who's incredible, my sister-in-law. Shout out to her and all her family. And some are in Venezuela and some are here. And it's, seeing those helicopters, planes, and bombs in Caracas immediately when I saw the video, even though it wasn't a news video, it was just a social media video of people in Caracas filming outside their high-rise windows. I knew exactly what it was because we've had these little inklings of oil tankers and, canceling flights, no-fly zones, Trump making threats. So we knew something was imminent, but we didn't know what. And then it's just a very different scene than what I grew up in. Yes, I grew up in a couple of coup attempts, one of which was in 1992 in November when Hugo Chavez himself did a coup attempt in Venezuela in November that year. And he essentially killed a couple of TV station workers in Caracas at the media station. And so all of a sudden we see this man on TV named Hugo Chavez in military clothing saying, I'm now the leader of this nation. And everybody was like, who's Hugo Chavez, right? But we thought he's, I guess, the new president. Well, he wasn't. And he did get arrested and put in jail. And then when he came out as a felon, ran for president and won. And that was sort of the beginning of a lot of changes. All that to say, there were circumstances in Venezuela with a lot of political things going on that gave the soil for what rose into these promises, this overpromise, underdeliver, disenfranchised people. A lot of what we saw probably leading up to 2016 here when Trump got elected, and also as well leading up to his most recent election when we have a situation here in the United States that I've always felt like has some elements that mirror what I grew up seeing when a model democracy changed overnight. And so, yeah, it was a model democracy. It was a wealthy nation. It was the pride of South America in a lot of ways. The best university was in Caracas at the time. Being Venezuelan was something to really be proud of. And then over time, things have really changed.
I do want to get into the politics like the last election, and I put that in quotes in Venezuela. But I also want folks, a lot of folks now this week have been talking about Venezuela, and to them it's just a word. But to you, it's the Venezuela, as you put it, that you carry in your bones. So can you give folks a sense of the Venezuela that you carry in your bones?
Aw, thank you for this question. Because I think honestly, carrying it in my bones causes me a lot of ache. And I don't say that as if I'm in the same situation that Venezuelan citizens are. Certainly not. Whatever I feel is just a fraction, and it's times a trillion what they're feeling and experiencing. But I will say that growing up there, I have Venezuelan culture, and like culturally, I'm very Venezuelan, even if my passport doesn't say that. And it's because they formed me, they raised me, they fed me. My favorite meal is cachapas con queso de mano and jugo de parchita. And if you haven't had that, please go support your local Venezuelan business and eat this yummy food, and you can thank me later. But it's yeah, I basically the land and the beauty and the culture and the dancing and the songs, they're a part of me. And I watching such a beautiful land be so assaulted over time. At this point, we've seen Russians and Iranians and Chinese come in and take the oil and colonize. We've seen Cubans come in. It was Cubans that were mostly killed that night of the raid around Maduro because even Chavez largely didn't trust Venezuelans themselves to guard him. And so, there's a lot of colonization that has happened, and that's, in the last 27 years by various people. But what I carry in my bones are the beaches, the most beautiful beaches you'll ever see. So when I imagine, and I wrote about this in my Substack article, and my therapist can attest to this, whenever I think of my happy place, it's always a particular island off the coast of Venezuela that I used to go to a lot growing up. And there's a national park called Morrocoy. Please Google it because it's absolutely gorgeous. And I hope things do get better there so we can all go visit again. It's a bunch of islands in the Caribbean. So my city, Valencia, if you drive down to Puerto Cabello, which I think was in a Reuters News article today, a picture of that, it's a port. And It's in the news today because there's an oil tanker that has been intercepted and they're showing pictures of oil tankers. But
Mm.
Puerto Cabello is where you would go and get a boat to take to, you would just tell the boat driver, take me to one of these islands, and you would name the island you wanted to go to. And my favorite one was always Playuela, and there's a particular side of it called Playuelita. It's where I got my husband proposed to me there.
Oh,
He's from
wow.
the US,
Did
he grew
Jason,
up in
was
Thailand.
Jason in Venezuela as well?
He was not. He grew up in Thailand and India
Oh,
as a US citizen in international schools as well. But we met in college and then we were on a trip there. We're at my first trip where I took him to Venezuela when we were dating and he proposed to me in my favorite beach in the whole world. And then later, years later, when we were living in Indonesia working and I found out I was expecting my first son, I was able to tell Jason we were expecting on that same place where he proposed to me on Playuelita. So it carries so much significance for me, not just because I also wrote my college essays on Playuelita underneath the palm tree in the hammock. It's just a place that I think of in my mind when I'm stressed or need a happy place to imagine. Venezuela is the one of the most beautiful places you will ever visit. It's got
mm,
tall mountains in the Andes with snow on top at Pico Bolivar, and it had the highest cable car in the world at the time. It has the tallest waterfall in the world in the Amazon region of Angel Falls. It's got sand dunes. It's just an incredibly beautiful land with a lot of natural resources, including gold and diamonds and all kinds of elements that we love here in Silicon Valley to make our technology, as well as the largest resources in the world in terms of oil. So.
yeah, yeah. And tell us about the people. You've alluded to them, to your people there a couple times, but there is something unique and special about your people.
Yes, I think to be Venezuelan is just such a blessing. I think that even though I'm not a citizen, being raised there as from childhood onward, what it meant for me being in that culture was there's a lot of happiness even in the midst of hard times. And I don't say that in a way that I think is probably causing a lot of cultural miscommunication right now, which is the celebration is a huge part of Venezuelan life. And to celebrate is to be Venezuelan, to have parties, to have parrillas on the weekend where you grill meat. And we don't even put a lot of spiciness into the meat because the meat's so good. You don't really have to. We want to taste the flavor of the really good meat. And so you get together with your friends and your neighbors. We, most recently celebrated Christmas, and every year on Christmas, I remember Venezuelan Noche Buena, which is the 24th, is really the big day there instead of the 25th. And so it's sort of this all night thing till like the wee hours of the morning, but you often go to church with your family, even if you're not normally church going, you usually go that night. And there's special services, and then there's some particular family member or neighbor's house that you go to, and there's special foods called ayacas put on banana leaves. Everybody makes them. And Noche Buena is also when you put your shoes out and the baby Jesus puts presents on your shoes. So it's not much of a Santa Claus culture, but there's very special traditions. There's very special songs. I grew up singing this song called Niño Lindo with the cuatro, which is a four-string little guitar like a ukulele. There's so much culture and richness. There's so much poetry that I grew up with. So there's a lot of richness, both in the land and in the culture of the people. And I think that laughter is probably a big key also of Venezuelan culture because the ability to laugh and find joy in the midst of some of the deepest, most difficult types of suffering that humans can experience was something I learned from Venezuelans even before this, Chavez and Maduro regime, which certainly is a thing that they have honed over time to help them both build a level of resilience that most people have never had to build, and also carries its own level of exhaustion to have to build that. But laughter and celebration and dancing merengue and salsa dancing, which I grew up learning there, is a way to not just shake it off literally, because your body needs to kind of de-stress these things, but it's a way to say, almost as a form of resistance, that no matter how much poverty we're experiencing, no matter how much the government is corrupt and taking from us, no matter how many people that you say they can't speak out against you, like we can somehow still dance. And so
Mm,
I think that that's an element that the world could use a lesson in from the Venezuelans. And what I really hope is people begin to center them and listen to them. Because I'm seeing a lot of news channels here in the US where not a single Venezuelan is given a microphone. And I just think they deserve to be heard, especially when
yes.
people don't even know their history or where their country even is. They're the experts on Venezuela. In fact, The other day I thought we need a word like mansplaining is for women.
Yeah.
You need a word like explaining Venezuela to Venezuelans because that's not something we should be doing. If you've
Yeah.
never been there or don't know where it is, please listen to them. Don't make them explain their history. Go read about it. There's enough information. And if you're confused, you can ask questions. But yeah, please don't explain Venezuela to Venezuelans.
It's interesting you bring that up. I posted something the other day, a couple days in advance of January 6th, but it was the morning that I released it the morning that we were hearing about what was happening. I guess you had already been up all night watching the reports come in. But one of the comments, I just mentioned Venezuela as saying, hey, kind of the way I mentioned what happened in Minnesota today. Hey, this essay is not about Venezuela, but I want to acknowledge what's happening there. And there are ties between not just what happened on January 6th, but what's still happening with January 6th in a lot of ways. And there were several people who piped up on in comments that insisted on talking about Venezuela, and in particular, the presumption that the Venezuelans better like this or else, kind of a thing. Like, well, the Venezuelans are happy about it, and if they're not, they should be. Like, dude, you've never left, Santa Clarita Valley, let alone California or the United
Right.
States. Like, now all of a sudden you're an expert on, the people of Venezuela. Like, but it was just that posture that just I don't know. I wish an eye roll was sufficient to be the response to that. But I did want to ask you about that. You took the time to think through what the people of Venezuela actually need. Folks, you've spoken with folks, you've been in contact with folks. Can you go through for us what that we're presuming to, or the not we, the Trump administration is presuming to talk about what he can get out of it, what his friends in the oil industry can get out of it. But we've done the Trump administration has done a pretty radical thing. One thing to your point that I haven't heard about is, well, what do the Venezuelans need? So I'd love for you to speak to that a little bit.
Yes. What do the Venezuelans need should be the question everybody's asking. And at the same time, understanding they're not a monolith either. But I will say, if you're listening to enough voices, you will see a pattern in that the majority of them were celebrating when Maduro was captured.
Of course.
Now,
Yeah.
that's not true inside the country because they are not safe to do so. And a particular part of the history to understand is, I had friends early on that were Chavistas, meaning they supported Hugo Chavez. And then, some of those who supported Maduro later when this bus driver was somebody that Maduro was a bus driver. And then Hugo Chavez, as he was dying of cancer, recommended that he sort of anointed him, said, would you elect him? And so he sort of became the successor and a lot of, really strong concerns around the elections not being fair. And you can look all that up. But over the years, so Venezuelans have tried so hard. They have gone out and banged pots and pans. There's been coup attempts, one of which it looks as though the U.S. was backing and behind and it failed. And, over the years, they've fought so hard while starving. 90% of the people are in poverty and a large amount of people are in abject poverty. People have been disappeared, tortured. And if you were Chavista, you would get this box of groceries. And if you weren't, you just didn't. So obviously, your ability to survive, even early on in this kind of back-to-back regime, this Hydra head situation, has been one in which if you speak out, you will likely not survive, which is
Mm.
why we have this diaspora of 8 million people that have left to go to all these different countries, including the US, but all over, Europe and South America as well. And it's not because they don't love their country, but because they had no other choice but to survive. And many of them walking across the Darien Gap, which is, where 90% of them, men and women, will get sexually assaulted. And some of them don't survive at all. And then they finally get here, and then look what's happening here. So I would say they don't all have the same experience, even in the diaspora. Some got to fly here, some had to walk through hell. And And then some got to countries where they were treated how we're treating them with ICE raids and alligator Alcatraz and, blaming, calling all of them part of Tren de Aragua or Cartel de los Soles or whatever people are saying about them, sending them to El Salvador to seaside. They've not been treated well here for the most part. And in other countries, there's some variety of that. So that's what I mean when I say they're not a monolith. The experiences are all somewhat different. And yet, even in those different experiences, those who seem to feel free to speak out, and I would argue the ones in the US have a level of also not feeling free for obvious reasons
Yeah.
to say the full truth. Most of them were very happy and celebrating that Maduro was ousted and not questioning the ideology so much because I think in the sense, and I wrote about this in the Substack article, I've heard different metaphors being thrown out there by Venezuelans that if you're not surviving and someone comes to rescue you, so if you're swimming in the ocean and you're drowning and a boat comes and extends you a hand, you don't ask how and why and start debating the ideology of international laws. You just thank them. And I don't mean that to diminish, and I don't think they do either. They're not naive, they're not unaware. They fully understand the ramifications of this. But I think I would describe Venezuelans, both inside the country and in the diaspora, for the large part, as a part of a collective trauma, a complex trauma. And I know that some people kind of prickle at the word trauma as if it's overused, and maybe it is in some cases, but in this case, I think it certainly applies. Most people are carrying this visceral, embodied experience of hypervigilance. When's the next shoe going to drop? Are my parents alive? We have, family members and friends where they've passed away and you can't go see them. There's children that have been born in exile and they've never met their grandparents and they're 20 years old. And so this is something that triggered all of that, certainly, and it still is for a lot of people. But at the same time, that celebration really it reminds me of the wicked witch is dead, like let's it's or the Jews escaping Pharaoh, like yeah, there's still danger around the corner, we're not out of the woods yet, but let's take a moment to just say finally this man who has done so many crimes against humanity and the world just seemed to turn a blind eye while letting people come in and take their resources and have multiple colonizers at once while they're crying out for help to the UN and to the Organization of American States, to the US, to all these countries. And meanwhile, there's protests both in the US and in other countries saying all this stuff about Donald Trump and centering him.
Yeah.
And it just is a question of when are we going to center Venezuelans? When are we going to listen to the fact that they're really happy about this and also worried and terrified and feeling all types of things? In the States, I would say that, there's a thing called Magazuelan, and you may have heard of that, that many of the ones who fled here and made that difficult journey of various forms, especially the Darien Gap version of it, that if you survived all that and came in the last 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and you have fled a danger, what you want here is to have safety. And you'll do whatever it takes to not have this also be unsafe. And that can do a lot to someone's brain, especially when they are believing they could be sent to alligator Alcatraz. So, the support of Trump has a lot of nuance behind it. And I think it's just important to know that the Magazuelans themselves, and they don't all support, the ones that do support Trump do so for various reasons. And I think that when you listen to the various perspectives of Venezuelans, you'll start to hear some of that nuance.
So you have such an interesting perspective because you did spend your formative years in Venezuela, but you're also a U.S. citizen, family here. So I have a few basic questions. It's like the who, what, when, where, how, why,
Yeah.
But I'd love for you to be, maybe if you could answer it from both perspectives. When I was first thinking, for example, what's actually happened? I know that Maduro was arrested and detained and brought to the States as along with his wife. But now the question for me takes a different, there's a different dimension to it because to your point, I'm curious, what has happened from the perspective of Venezuelans? What has happened? What has actually happened thus far from the perspective of Americans? So if you
Yeah.
could answer from both perspectives, that'd be really helpful.
Yes, well, I'll try my best. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of nuance on either side because I know that the US is not a monolith and neither are Venezuelans. But I think to sort of try to simplify it from the Venezuelan perspective, this person is not the president. So it's not true to say the US went in and captured a sitting president. He actually did not win the most recent election. It's, arguable he hasn't won any of them, but this most recent one last summer was very clear. And Edmundo Gonzalez was the winner. And Maria Corina Machado, who many people know as the one who most recently received the Nobel Peace Prize for Venezuela, which was a huge moment that really felt like the world was finally seeing Venezuelans and their struggles over the last 27 years. But she was not allowed to run for president because of her strong efforts in the opposition. She's very influential, very popular, in spite of what Donald Trump said in that press conference the next
Yeah.
day. But she has the support of the majority of the people in this way of really pushing forward something that had been stagnant in certain ways. And so she helped Edmundo Gonzalez get elected, but Nicolas Maduro has not left his seat and has said he was the winner. And so that's part of what's going on. And in addition to all of his crimes against humanity, and we could, there's long lists of those and lots of data and numbers. But certainly he has, in the Venezuelan perspective, I would say, not only gotten very wealthy off the nation's resources at the expense of his own people, whom he also has tortured and repressed, but also has further advanced the Chavismo, where there were certainly political elements that mixed in with a very narcissistic leader who was quite greedy and unethical.
Mm.
And I think that when we discuss ideology, the reason Venezuelans are often saying, can we not talk about this so much in terms of politics and ideologies and even the oil? Because yes, they know it's about the oil, but it's also something that for the longest time they've not had access to the benefits of. And so it's almost as though this is a cost they're willing to pay to oust their leader. And this is where I, as a US citizen, have a big beef
Yeah.
with Donald Trump, among many other reasons. Yes, international law was broken, the Geneva Convention, blah, blah, blah. Yes. And those, I don't want to diminish that. That's a big deal. And it's a big deal in terms of the global political scene. But for a moment, if we just focus in on Venezuela, which is something I hope we can do and center their voices, maybe it's because of so many years of being traumatized and the complex nature of that trauma again and again and again and again. And we often see with countries like that, if we're looking at, Cambodia under Pol Pot, or we could pick different places in the world that have experienced extreme situations for their people. At some point, it's hard to dream of a future that's completely free, that doesn't cost you something enormous. And so they've fought so hard. They're so exhausted. They're some of the most resilient people you will meet because of it, but they're tired and they want to rest. And it feels like a relief that this man is gone, even if they'll see who's the vice president who's now been put in charge, maybe is bad or worse than him. At least he's gone.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the Venezuelan perspective, at least what I largely understand for the most part, with a lot of nuance. And then in the US, it's certainly, I think we could debate it, but it seems very clear to most of us this is about oil. And Donald Trump didn't even seem to try to hide that. And certainly not in the last few days of, what he's been doing with these, intercepting oil tankers. And so it seems as though we did rescue somebody in a boat that was drowning, and then we handed them an invoice to help them. And
Mm.
that's where I have one of the biggest beefs with Donald Trump, because if you're going to actually help people, you don't charge them for your help when they're dying, when they need your help as the largest, most powerful nation in the world to one of the most, poorest nation in the world, not in terms of resources, but in terms of, $3 minimum wage, which is the lowest in South America. That this is a country that has needed help. And it's a special kind of nefarious to me personally to go in and rescue somebody who's drowning and then hand them an invoice and say, I'm taking your oil. And yes, he's promised to give some of those proceeds to Venezuelans, but the lack of transparency means that is probably not going to work out well for them. But I don't think that for the most part, Venezuelans that I've listened to are focused on that because they never had a hope in this situation that they would get anything from the oil anytime soon. In the future, maybe, but it's almost like they realize when you're playing, when you're on a chessboard of these narcissists, maybe even psychopaths, I
Yeah.
don't know, that are playing on this world stage. You've got China, you've got Russia, you've got Putin in Russia, you've got Iran, you've got Cuba, you've got the US, you've got Maduro. The leaders of all these nations are playing chess and you're pawns. So your best hope is okay, charge us for the oil, but get him out of here. And I think that also, the perspective of it seems as though there was this months long plan on the US side, at least according to that press conference where we heard from the military leaders when Donald Trump brought in all his men that had sat at Mar-a-Lago that night watching it happen, Pete Hegseth and all these different ones, all wearing blue suits, not a woman in the room. Just wanted to point that out.
Yeah.
Anyway, we know that peace making is so much better, statistically speaking, with women in the room, but maybe that's why they weren't there. But that press conference really showed us that the CIA had infiltrated back in the summer. They had had this long-term plan, and then they executed it once the weather was favorable within the Caracas, situation, and they did it when they did it. And so certainly there was a lot of forethought about how to take him out. It doesn't appear clear to us that there was any robust plan of what to do after that. So it's just like Rambo, be a hero,
Yeah.
go in there. Maybe he's trying to win the Nobel Peace Prize again because he's jealous that Maria Corina Machado got it or whatever. She did dedicate it to him after she got it, which was very controversial. Some people say she understood her place as a pawn on the chessboard and was just trying to help herself and her people survive. But certainly Donald Trump, completely undermined her with his statement in that day, which I think a lot of Venezuelans expected him to put his support behind Maria Corina Machado. And instead, he said she didn't have the influence to be, or the support of the Venezuelans to be able to lead, which I thought was not only untrue, but also ironic considering his approval rating was like 30 something percent, but it
Yeah.
just bumped up to the 40s because that's what happens when you bomb or invade a country, then you get higher approval ratings. So
Right.
it's
Right.
it's very messed up.
Yeah, you did anticipate a couple of my questions. One of which is it does seem like there was a lot of planning for this moment, for that moment on Saturday, but not a lot of planning, if any, for what to do moving forward. So, just as an example, another one of the questions, and you've already answered this, is the why behind it. The why behind it. It's not about regime change. Other than the optics of taking a dictator and that moment, that military action. It's not about any number, stopping the flow of drugs, for example. I mean, there's clear examples of hypocrisy just in the last week of why that's
Yeah.
not really the case. Maybe some folks in Trump's inner circle are saying this, but that's not really. But in his press conference, I don't know how many times he said oil. But I do know how many times he said democracy, and it wasn't many, if any.
Zero. Yeah, I don't think he said it at all.
Right. So
Yeah.
that's my question: is what's the plan moving forward? So for example, let's say it's about oil primarily, and he's talking about oil. But the regions where, my understanding, the little research I've been able to do is that the regions where the oil is, there aren't roads there. There isn't a power grid there. The infrastructure doesn't exist to get the oil, to extract the oil, to transmit the oil. So there really isn't a plan here. I don't know if you've heard anything different on that score.
No, I mean, it's just a hot mess. I think that this is not super uncharacteristic of what we've seen out of President Trump. A lot of optimism about what can be done without really getting good advice. I remember in 2016 when he first came in, saying he was kind of famous for saying, I don't really need advisors. And I think if he had just listened to a few people and understood the situation and thought through the rest of what could happen, he would have certainly noticed the infrastructure is not there. But then again, he's Mr. Art of the Deal, and this, business is what he does in ways where he crosses a lot of lines. And it seems as though Yes, it's about the oil. It feels as though, in Silicon Valley, sometimes we'll see these big companies, and if something's going wrong in the company, the board will just remove the CEO and then put somebody else in very quickly. It seems as though this feels not so much like a Cold War invasion of a Latin American country, like, we probably saw when we grew up, especially me, like I was in Venezuela when the Panama situation happened with Manuel Noriega in 1989 and the US invaded and took him out and called, drug. It was all that. If you see the pictures of Maduro being captured and you compare them to the ones of the capture of Manuel Noriega, they look eerily similar. There's this media almost expectation that happens. Part of it is theater. It's very political theater in this way. And so, I grew up having to explain to my Venezuelans, even my bus driver that would pick me up for school in the mornings and take me home, would often ask me how I felt about the Noriega situation as a citizen. And I remember feeling really ashamed and trying to say, I don't know, I can't defend it because it feels awful what we just did. But that was a Cold War version of it. The drugs were a part of it, but it was also, at least the rhetoric was about democracy. That's not something we saw from President Trump at this time. It seems as though we are in, I guess, what they're calling the Donroe Doctrine instead of the
Yeah.
Monroe Doctrine, which is just,
Yeah.
he has to, I don't know, everything has to be named after him. But it's more about business and money and oil and these types of minerals, Greenland, all these things are coming into the conversation. And so it's less about spreading democracy and trying to stop communism or Marxism. It's more about this. And so it seems like it was really a business deal where he has mixed business with politics to such a degree where that's the framework, that's the lens going into it. So what's going to happen? I mean, they'll see the current, vice president who became president, who is rumored, and I think major news sources covered that she was in Russia when this all went down. She's known by Venezuelans to be very Machiavellian. Her brother is high up in the government too. Her dad was tortured in Venezuela and died, I think, in a prison. So she grew up with a very political family, very involved family, but she's very much a corrupt individual in terms of her, willingness to rob the Venezuelan people and benefit herself. And so I would argue that Trump is somewhat familiar with that kind of a person. And so it's one of those things where we were seeing in that press conference these narratives around, well, if she plays well, it was almost like they were loyalty testing her. Is she going to be on our side? And then threatening that they would invade again. Or I think Trump said the consequences will be worse for her than it was for Maduro if she doesn't play ball, kind of thing. And so, what's going on behind the scenes, she's been saying publicly, at least in the first few days, she was saying things that seemed as though she was against what Trump was doing. But once again, when you're playing chess with these individuals, what happens behind the scenes isn't always what you're seeing in the theater, the political theater that's going on. So I don't know. Trump is definitely probably, I would assume, close with some of the Houston, Texas guys that run some of these oil companies here in the US. We had a big deal with Citgo that just went through last year that was a really long and lengthy process as to what would happen there. So yes, I have no doubt that when it comes to the business side of things, if he's listening to any advisors, it's probably people who are also excited about getting back and getting oil and maybe throwing a bunch of money around building those roads, not to necessarily help Venezuelans, but to make sure they get the oil to where it needs to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, it's interesting how you're sort of reading my mind when you talk about Trump, for example, as a business person, that he's not the kind of business person I've ever dealt with. He's not someone who thinks like a partner, or even a buyer. He's someone who thinks like a robber. I think you used that
Yeah.
word. And that's just not a sustainable. So I've known about him because I grew up in Jersey. I've known about him since he was like with the USFL and the Jersey Generals, and he basically everything, as someone said, wrote the book called "Everything Trump Touches Dies." He ruined Atlantic City. He ruined the USFL.
Yeah.
So I knew about it back then, but then I really got to know about him when he did The Apprentice because I was just getting started in my entertainment practice. In fact, I was just in touch with a fella yesterday, the fella who was running marketing at NBC for like 20 years. And the reason I say it's not sustainable, the ones that I know most intimately that were closest to him, it's not sustainable because he burned those bridges. They're
He
not
does.
doing, they would never do business with him again. Ask any of the folks from AC, any of the folks, from the USF, and it's not sustainable for a country either to do business that way. So I don't buy the whole idea that he's a businessman, the art of the deal. He does have some virile talents and survival instincts, but that's a whole other story. I don't mean to talk about Trump too much here, but it is his actions, and he has centered himself in this story as opposed to Venezuelans. So let me ask you this: this is a good and a much more appropriate pivot, and something I would like to hear about. What is your hope for Venezuela and for your friends in Venezuela?
I have so many hopes and dreams, and I think so many Venezuelans have too, and that's something that I've not lost. That I would say Maria Corina Machado had a way of helping people have that hope or sustain it and maybe even dream again. And I think that when Maduro was ousted and we saw these images around the world in, Florida and Madrid, Barcelona, Santiago, Chile, and Argentina, everywhere, Venezuelans were dancing and celebrating and waving their flags and crying and singing songs that are very known to the Venezuelan community together in one voice. And I think there was a version of hoping and dreaming in a new way. And I can only imagine how that some of it might have been dashed in the last few hours and days, as it's not been clear that this is going to move forward in a way that's going to benefit them. And yet there is this version of holding on to hope that I still have. Immediately, one of my good friends that I reach out to who's still in Valencia, who responded over WhatsApp. And of course, I would never bait her or expect her to say anything political because that would put her at risk. But when I sort of was back and forth asking how she was doing, it was, oh, and you're going to get to come visit now. And I think that's what I've heard a lot of Venezuelans saying. There was even a little boy with a sign, I think in the Madrid celebration, and his sign in Spanish said, I get to meet my abuelos now, my grandparents. And I think that's the hope, is that families can be reunited. People can go hug their loved ones, give them besitos, go back to the beaches, go home and begin to rebuild this country to flourish. But even if the entire Maduro network and this hydra of Chavismo and Maduro um, creature, whatever it is, had been ousted, even starting from scratch, it would still take a while to do this nation building, which does seem to be something Trump is not largely interested in, with the removal of US aid and a lot of that soft power that we've done for so long. But all that to say is what I hope from the world is that we rally around Venezuelans, that we center them, put them at the mic, listen to their perspectives, which are not a monolith and are full of nuance. We hear their stories, we grieve with them for the ones they've lost, that they're grieving all over again when something like this happens. They're grieving from the dads they knew that protested in Caracas that didn't make it. They're grieving for the children that don't know the grandparents and that type of thing. And they're grieving for the ones that are still political prisoners that yet have not been released. And we've been crying out for them to be released. And so I hope the international community both listens to Venezuelans, hears their stories, celebrates with them, doesn't meet them with our frameworks, especially here in the US, where it's either a Republican or Democrat framework, that we listen to them without these frameworks and ideologies and let their story be something we empathize with and bear witness to
Yeah.
what they've gone through. They've felt so alone, and they're not wrong. They've done everything they could possibly do and tried to do it democratically, and it just didn't work. And many people have died. I mean, I grew up in Valencia, and Carabobo is our state. And Venezuela, if you're old enough, may remember that they are world renowned for the beauty queens. And so actually I went to high school with Miss Venezuela. One of my classmates became Miss Venezuela, but beauty pageants are very common in the country. And so the state of Carabobo, the Miss Carabobo tourism, I think it was, she was in a protest a few years back and she got shot in the head. So there's no one, even the most pride of the nation, that they wouldn't go after if you speak out. And so the world has largely ignored this in terms of helping them by debating their ideologies about laws and Geneva Conventions, and those are important. But at some point, if our system has failed this country for so long, we owe them to center them, to listen to them, to send in aid, to put pressure, to hold the United States accountable for what we've done and what we're doing. And I don't mean send Maduro back, because there are a lot of protests saying send this man back to his country that he's the president of. He's not. He does not need to go back. He does not need to rule these people again. But what we do need to do is hold our country accountable. And so as a US citizen, I try to not go too far into explaining Venezuelans' perspectives for themselves, but just listen and learn and try to repeat what I hear from them. But as a US citizen, I will be fighting very hard to hold my government accountable for what we're doing. And as a world citizen, to speak into what the UN is doing or not doing and the Organization of American States. It's long past time that we get in there and help people build back what they've lost. And we owe that to them, because they are an incredible group of people that we can learn so much from. And I guarantee you, if you get to know Venezuelans and get to know their food and their culture, that you will learn so much and it will change you in some beautiful ways. And there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge that they carry in their own bones from years of building the kind of resilience that they've built as a community.
Yeah, yeah. I want to ask you a version of the TPNR question, which you've heard before. Basically, how do we talk about politics and religion across our differences without killing each other, or is it even possible? How do we do that better? But I want to ask it this way. What I've noticed in the last 3 or 4 days is a common thread. My friends who watch a certain news channel and in that ecosystem of news and analysis, there are a couple common threads. One is if there is any critique of the actions of the Trump administration, one is seen sort of generally that you're automatically one of you guys. So just as an example, there's a fellow who has a nationally syndicated radio show who commented, and he started his comment. And this was the one that was really about January 6th, but there was just a one clause about like, hey, I need to acknowledge what's happening in Venezuela. And then the whole thread became about Venezuela. He said, can you show me where you guys complained about Obama? So he did the what about thing. There was someone else also talking about, he was objecting to the fact that I'm not completely, complimentary about everything and anything that Trump does. And he finished by saying, your Hollywood is showing. Another had just posted a meme. On one side was reward $25 million for Nicolas Maduro. On the other side is something about, I don't even know what this is, Kamala Harris. But the caption says, Biden had a $25 million bounty on Maduro. Now Democrats are saying it's bad. We captured him. So by the way, I think I'm not a Democrat. That's why stuff like that bothers me. But the thing, the through line is that there isn't any. If one has even an ounce of disagreement or critique of, you can't critique Trump in this situation. And two is the reflex to assume that one is a liberal, the left, a Democrat. Not that there's anything wrong. Like, listen, if I was like. A lot of friends are the left. There's nothing wrong with it. I would totally embrace it if I was, but like,
Yeah.
but so that's my TP. That's the version of my TPNR question. When you get some of those sort of reflexes from friends, maybe the way you put it, Magazuelans. How do we engage with folks in a more edifying way when that's the kind of thing that we're hearing?
I always go in situations like this over the last few years I put on my trauma informed certification hat. And I know we've talked about trauma already, and it could be one of those words that you don't believe it even exists. But science, social psychologists are the experts showing us this information. And what I learned in tsunami relief, which I spoke about prior to this, and I've also worked in a megachurch where there's a lot of spiritual abuse. So I see the patterns here. And what we see is when people are coming out of very traumatic situations, they often become very dogmatic. So that means that gray is not an option. And gray is scary. You need a strong foundation. In the US, it could be becoming MAGA, it could be becoming very leftist. And in Venezuela, it could also be, versions of the right or the left that they're, expressing. And so, I guess the way it would look in Venezuela is the fear that if you aren't very dogmatic about Maduro or even they'll say right now and that whole regime, that you won't get fed. So
Mm.
you're going to be afraid. And there's a lot of fear behind when I see these dogmatic whatabouts here in the US. And I would say also, if a leader that you admire and have aligned yourself with, whether it's a religious leader or a political leader, um, if you're not able to question them, that is a red flag. If
Oh
you're in a
yeah.
megachurch and your pastor doesn't allow you to be questioned, if you follow Donald Trump or Maduro or any political leader and you can't question them, even if you can't question, Kamala Harris or Joe Biden, or look with nuance at, the Epstein files and realize there were people on all sides involved, right? It's a terrible, terrible thing where these survivors are still not centered. And what I see too often is that leads to a lot of victim blaming of, Venezuelans for not, doing what they should do and not being aligned. If they question, they get blamed. In the US, people who ask these questions about international law and nuance around this gray get blamed. But if we can't see gray and we're afraid of it, I think we have to ask ourselves, am I reacting out of this dogmatism from some version of trauma that I've recently gone through, or maybe a childhood experience that you've not unpacked? And that could be true for a lot of people. We could have, attachment issues that play into this, whether you're anxious attachment or avoidant attachment. But regardless, humans need safety and security and knowing that their basic human needs are going to be provided for. And if that feels under threat in your body, in an implicit or an explicit memory that's being brought up, politics is sometimes the venue, the arena in the United States, especially where that gets fought like gladiators. And so I think that it's important if you start to see that happen to just say, take a deep breath and maybe three deep breaths. Maybe get an Aura ring, which I got for Christmas, which tells me when I'm stressed.
Oh nice.
And yeah, and learn that maybe you're putting yourself in a situation into a framework that's not healthy for you or the person that you're talking with. And I describe Facebook as going into the upside down. I don't like to go there.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it feels dangerous. And so I think that we do need to learn to breathe and to check in with ourselves and do the hardest work there is, which is self-leadership and self-awareness. And so I hope that we see that more in your work you're doing this year with talking politics and religion without killing each other and without killing ourselves, because
Yeah.
it hurts us when we go there.
It's a really good point because the last 6 months have been lessons for me in determining, there is a line somewhere, and I need to be more aware of where that line is and when I'm approaching that line, just for myself. If for no other reason than once I cross that line, there ain't no coming back for me, and I'm modeling the exact wrong behavior. I'm becoming part of the problem. Plus, it's really bad for me. It's just so bad for me. So recognizing when I'm going into a danger zone, avoiding that, whether that is being able to wrangle the conversation back to sanity and civility, or sometimes just saying, you know what, this is not the conversation for me. You are not the conversation partner for me. And just being okay with that sometimes. Uh, you know,
Yeah.
maybe somebody else can touch them, maybe somebody else can connect with them in a way that I can't, but I do have to know that I say it all the time. I believe in Jesus, but I ain't Jesus, so
Yeah.
there's a lot of things I am just not capable of. Did you have any, this is weird for me to ask. I almost always ask it, but it's still weird for me to ask on this one in particular. Do you have any questions for me on this one?
Hmm. I always feel like because I didn't grow up here, even though I'm a US citizen, there's a lot that I'm still learning about the US perspective. And so I guess my question would be, do you hear anything in how I describe how the US is seeing this that I might be missing in terms of the dialogue or what's going on?
The only thing I would say, but you've picked up on this, that there is a certain myopia that
Hmm.
is just the default posture of so many Americans, that we are
Yeah.
the center of the world, and everything else is simply an object that revolves around us. So, but you're aware of that. You talked about that. And also the idea that, however, in America alone, there's 340 million people. I remember, 2 years ago when the war started in Israel, just in my own family, there was great disagreement. All nine of the kids were called up and serving in one way or the other, but just the two surviving members of my generation of the family were in great disagreement on certain things. Of course, they support Israel's right to exist, but they had disagreements about Netanyahu's government. And that's
Yeah.
just one family. So the idea that you're speaking of the fact that every individual has unique perspectives, and that should be accounted for. And the only way I think we can do that is kind of what you just alluded to, which is have that one conversation with one human being at a time. So I wouldn't push back and give you any sort of exhortation about, hey, you need to be doing this, because you're there's an awareness in how you're thinking about this, and you're accounting for a lot of what a lot of others are missing. So yeah, I really appreciate that.
Thank
Thing I
you.
want to make sure that folks hear. I want to make sure folks can easily find A World of Difference, a really wonderful podcast, and your Substack is just really, really helpful. So, how can folks find you in both of those places, and everywhere else you're doing some great work?
Thank you. Yeah, well, I'd love for you to come listen to a World of Difference podcast. You can find us at a worldofdifferencepodcast.com, where I interview people from different perspectives, leaders around the world across industries, trying to make a difference and bring their differences to the table. I truly believe, if you haven't noticed in this conversation, that we make our best decisions as leaders when we bring many perspectives around the table, because we all have blind spots. And when you bring different perspectives, then you start to see an aspect of the world or your leadership that you hadn't considered before. And it opens up a whole world of opportunity for you as a leader and the work that you're doing. So I'd love for you to join us there. And then you can find me at loriadamsbrown.com. I have a Substack, as you mentioned, so check me out there. And I also want to recommend that you find a Venezuelan voice to listen to if you don't speak Spanish, which you could use Google Translate. There are some bilingual voices out there. One that help you start with is Mariana Atencio. She's here in the US and she's fluent in both languages. And she has been covering Venezuelan news. And if you watch a news station and they don't have a reporter on there, maybe suggest that they bring her on, because
Mm.
Venezuelan reporters need to be at the microphone and there needs to be more than one of them, because once again, they're not all the same, but we need their perspectives, especially since the US is the one that did what we did. So,
Could you text me when we hang up the spelling? It's
yeah.
Mariana Atencio, you said?
At Atencio. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's great to follow. She's on Substack too, and she
Okay.
makes all kinds of great videos. She's excellent. Yeah.
Great, great. I'll put that in the show notes, as well as A World of Difference and your Substack, so folks can find you. We did cover a lot more than I even thought, but is there anything important we haven't discussed that you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I think I would like to say, if you're in the US listening to this and you're not a Venezuelan, please go listen to their voices online somehow or some way, or read their writing. And then if you have a local business that's run by a Venezuelan, please go support them right now. And just be kind. They're going through so much. They don't, once again, need to be explained about their country, but they do need a chance to share what they're going through and to have empathy. And everybody who's walking through something that's a mixture of celebration and fear deserves to be heard as a good neighbor. And then also, if you're Venezuelan and you're listening, what I hope is that you get to take a version of a break, at least sometimes during the day. I know myself, I've been very hypervigilant ever since the night it happened, and I'm struggling, according to my aura ring, with a lot of stress. And I've lived through this kind of thing before by working under civil war in Indonesia and Islamic law and all that. But I know that many of you are feeling the need to always be able to explain to people when they ask you what's happening. And you don't have to, as a Venezuelan, give everybody the history lesson that they can learn on their own. You don't have to educate everyone. And so I hope that if you're Venezuelan, you can take some time to practice some self care, to dance, to eat some arepas and cachapas and jugo de parchita and do whatever makes you imagine your happy place and just check in with yourself because what you're going through is really hard. And you've taught me to laugh and you've taught me to dance and to celebrate even in the midst of really hard things and to rely on each other. And I hope that you're continuing to do that for yourself and for others and that we do all get to join up in Venezuela at the beach one day and really just celebrate with our chinotos and our parchitas what has happened and what everybody has overcome.
Well, that's a great note to wrap it up. Lori, thank you so much for doing this. It really helps us get a little bit of a glimpse, and it points us in the right direction to learn a little bit more, to be better informed citizens, engaged citizens. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thanks, Corey, for letting me talk about Venezuelans. And I hope I represented them well. And I hope we come to a better place together for them.
Yeah, and it's always good to see you, Lori. Um,
You too.
As always, we'd like to thank Pew Research Center for making today's conversation possible, and we're grateful to our dear friends at the Village Square for coming alongside us in this work. And if you dig what we're doing here, engage with us on any of the socials. I'm easy to find. I'm at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey, S as in Sam, Nathan, at Corey S. Nathan, especially over on Substack. I really do like it over there. People actually read the articles on Substack. It's crazy.
They do.
Yeah. Unlike Facebook, they just see the headline and they start commenting. Anyway,
Right.
don't forget to subscribe over there, join the conversation, read the articles. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.